Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello, welcome back to Fighting on Film. Now, we may be in May, but we have an ANZAC Month hangover episode. As you may have been aware, Robert couldn't join us a couple of weeks ago to record, but he's with us today. He joined us for Long, the Short and the Tall a couple of weeks ago, months ago now, can't remember, it's been too long. And as you know, historian extraordinaire, written extensively about the war in the Far East. So what better film to talk about with us than Kokoda? Robert, welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's so good to be back with you guys talking about these films. And I've got a little bit of an affinity with Kokoda because I actually, believe it or not, have an Australian passport. I have a number of passports. Australian is one of them, having gone to school in Melbourne in the 1970s. So I was brought up with this story and know it quite well. And in fact, my brother has walked the Kokoda Trail.
Oh, who better to have on than Matt, hey?
Exactly, yeah.
So the movie is as he said, it's Kokoda, and the movie just follows a patrol of chocos, militiamen, as they get lost in the jungles defending the Kokoda Trail in 1942. That's your sort of elevator pitch there. Any thoughts before we move on to production and cast?
Well, I just think overall it's an extremely good film. I think the general problem that I've got with these sorts of films is they grab elements of truth and dramatize them. And, you know, Australians love nothing better than their military myths, all of which are grounded in reality, but, you know, have been adorned on the way. And that's the real challenge when we're looking at these sort of things. But I think on the whole, this film avoids those myths. And, you know, for those people who, and I've read a few reviews over the last week or two, who think that this is sort of made up and it's a paean to mateship and it didn't really happen. Well, they're actually wrong, because the Kokoda Trail was, you know, a historic reality, and the fighting was, I think, pretty well depicted in the film. The horror of the monsoon and of the Japanese and of the terrain, all that sort of stuff was captured brilliantly well. So overall, and the psychological dimension to fighting the Japanese here is really important. And I think one of the really interesting things that the film does bring out is the fact that actually the early militia soldiers from Australia, who weren't particularly well trained and were thrown into New Guinea to stop the Japanese, really were not prepared for what they had to fight. And the Imperial Japanese Army, as you've heard from me before, was one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world. And you've got these Australian part-timers turning up to fight them. And it is an extraordinary story in and of itself. I need to say at the outset that I'm not an expert in the Battle of Issawara or of the Kokoda Trail, although I've read a number of books on it. And but I do know quite a bit about how the Japanese fought, and I think the way in which the film portrayed it is worth having a good conversation about.
I agree. It's one of the more striking movies we've covered in ANZAC Month, or that we've looked at. I know there were a few more that we didn't get to cover, but this one really has a style, and it stays with that style throughout. And it's very different to the Australian movies that we've covered, because I think the main ones that we did cover were the sort of the Australian new wave, where all these movies were coming out with, you know, the people who went on to become very famous Australian actors like Mel Gibson, Sam Neill. But this one is very modern. It's a very different take to all those movies, and it just has a really different feel to it. So maybe, Matt, would you like to talk about the production, and then we can get more into it?
Absolutely. I suppose it's a new generation of filmmakers coming through, Australian filmmakers. It was directed and co-written by Alister Grierson, and he's also, in 2014, he directed Para's War, about the frontline cameraman who won Australia's first Oscar for his combat photography work, apparently.
He helped win it. It's people think it's Para, but it's actually the director Ken G. Hall who actually won the Oscar. But Para was the cameraman on the shoot.
Yeah, he's featured in the film, isn't he? The director.
Yeah.
Well, I've only seen the trailer so far, but Rob and I were discussing this before we recorded, and it's one we'd really like to cover on the show.
It looks fabulous. It looks amazing, doesn't it? Yeah.
The film was co-written with John Lonnie. Music was composed by Grierson's longtime collaborator, John Gray. And the cinematography, which I think we'll talk about a number of times throughout this chat, was done by Jules O'Loughlin. And he was another long-time collaborator with Grierson. And he recently shot some episodes of the historical TV series Black Sails, and recently worked on The Hitman's Bodyguard with Ryan Reynolds and Samuel L. Jackson, which is a little bit different in tone to this one, but interesting nonetheless. The stunt coordinator was Chris Anderson. Alan Mowbray was the armorer on the film, and he's worked on a number of interesting war movies throughout his career, including 1995's The Last Bullet, 1998's The Thin Red Line, 2005's The Great Raid, 2010's Beneath Hill 60, and 2013's The Railway Man with Colin Firth. The sound design, which I think was really quite competent in this, was done by Adrian Belinsky, and the special effects were done by Nicholas Burns, and the VFX were actually done by a lot of personnel from the Weta Digital Workshop. So really quite a competent crew behind it. In terms of historical advisor on the film, the Australian historian Peter Broun, who's written extensively on Kokoda and this theatre of war, was the principal historical advisor, and it looks like he did a good job of directing the writers and the director to get in some really interesting details into the film. But I have a feeling that Grierson also did quite a lot of his own research, given his other subject matter that he's made films on, including Para's War. I think he probably has an eye for detail.
I think it does show, actually. I think that the historical reality here is quite striking, actually. I think it may actually have been slightly overdone, and we can come on to that later in terms of how the Japanese were portrayed. But I think one of the important things to bear in mind when you're watching the film is to recognize that the Japanese were being portrayed as they were being perceived in the minds of the soldiers they were fighting. So the soldiers, knew that the Japanese were coming. They'd been told terrible things about the Japanese. They knew that they were fearsome fighting animals and all the rest of it. So the way in which the Japanese are presented really meets those depictions. It's not the actual reality, but it's done really, really well. And I think the way in which they've identified the story around being these men, they're officers. It's worth staying at the outset. This is the true story, and it's modelled on an actual patrol led by Lieutenant Sword. But that in the film, the officer is killed right at the outset, and it's the soldiers having to come up with decisions and deal with the reality fighting and the terrain and all this sort of stuff as they best could do it. That's quite a challenge to get, actually, and I think they did a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, me too. It's it doesn't let you forget that they're civilian soldiers as well, which I think I quite enjoy. So you get that element of, obviously they're going to play more into their fears because they're not soldiers every day of their lives. So and it's their first combat, or they've seen some combat before going into the line. So you still get that at the end where they get the whole, bloody chocos and AFI chumming it together at the end, and you get the sort of banter between the regular soldiers. It doesn't let you forget who they are, which I quite like, because sometimes movies can do that where it's sort of the characterization falls apart, even though there isn't much characterization in terms of learning who the men are, whether they've got sweethearts back home, etc. It does remind you of the unit that they're portraying, which I do quite like, because then you see it from a different angle, and you can sort of realize that these men they're just men at the end of the day. They're not soldiers, really. I do think that's one of the stronger parts of the movie.
The film was shot in Queensland on Mount Tamborine, and I think it stands in rather well. Some of those landscape shots that we get, and the panning shots up looking over the ridge line and down at the men climbing up the sides of the hills is really quite striking, and keys in nicely with photographs and footage from the actual campaign.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the real challenge, I mean, we talked about this with The Long, Short and the Tall, is how difficult it is to capture the realities of the terrain and the context of the environment. And this is where I think the film triumphs, because you not only get the mud and the, you know, in watching the feet climb up slowly up the track, you get a sense of the exhaustion created by this terrible terrain, and the monsoon as well, and and the night as well. The night comes early in the jungle, and it's always wet and it's miserable. This is not a place where humans survive well. And you know, in the first few minutes of the film, this is quite overwhelming, and you get a real sense of, I mean, this is a terrible place to have to fight a war, and that's really the experience of everyone who fought. Both in Burma and in New Guinea, of course. They had to fight the elements and survive even before they began to consider fighting the Japanese.
Yeah, it's very like sensual film, isn't it? There's a lot at play. It's with the rain hammering down and as you say, the mud and stuff. It's all the sound effects. Everything is the atmosphere it creates.
They overdo it slightly with one of the actors portraying a soldier looking for his mate, and he's covered in mud. I mean, he's head to toe in mud. In fact, later on in the film, when they're replaying that piece, he's not so heavily covered. So there's a bit of a
it's like an elaborate dream sequence, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like a nightmare, isn't it? Where I did like that. I think that whole opening sequence that we've been talking about is so effective, because not only does it introduce you to the location that the men are fighting in, but it also keys into all of the difficulties of fighting in that terrain where he's completely submerged. Someone pulls him out. Obviously, it turns out to be a bit of a nightmare sequence, because he finds his brother, and his brother has a snake in his belly, which is quite visceral. And I thought that kind of stopped that sequence dead a little bit for me. I thought, that is a little bit too much, but I suppose that's forgivable because it's a nightmare dream sequence type thing, and it is the kind of thing that
was the same for me. But you know, it's understandable.
I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was a nice little cold.
I enjoyed it too, and I liked the way that they nodded back to it at the end of the film, where he was looking for his brother. You know, in reality, and we got that same slightly less exaggerated shot of him clambering and struggling in the mud, and then that nice panning shot of the trail.
As again, it's the whole sort of the homage to the actual footage from the Kokoda Frontline documentary and the other bits of footage that were shot by the Australian cameramen there. I think that's one of the things I really enjoy about this movie, that is using its primary source material very effectively, and I really like that. But maybe we should just talk about the cast very quickly, because it's an interesting cast. We've got Jack Finsterer as Jack Schult. He was in Neighbours. He's most recently been in Home and Away. There's a lot of really prominent Australian television actors in this one. You have Simon Stone as Max Schult. He's the brother that you were talking about with the snake in the belly. He's an actor and director. He was in an Australian medical drama called MDA, and he most recently directed The Dig, the Netflix film with Ray Fiennes about the archaeological dig, which I thought was quite interesting. Steve Marquand as Sam. He's the Bren Gunner. He's prolific, another prolific TV actor. Home and Away, and he was in Beneath Hell 60 as well. You have William McInnes as the Colonel. He narrated the Slap TV show, if you remember that one. Remember it being quite a well-known Australian export back in the day. And he was in a series called Martial Law as well. But he worked for free for the movie. He did a day's worth of shooting, and he cited his admiration for the actual chaps who did the fighting. And he said, you know, if this movie helps people to remember their experiences, then he really wanted to work on the movie, and he worked for free. Shane Bourne as the Doctor. He was also in the MDMA, that's not right. He was also in the MDA medical drama, and he was in the Australian version of Are You Being Served in the 80s, if you can remember that one. Anybody out there?
I would love to see that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that's like.
No, it still had the I think it still had John Humphreys in it when I was doing a bit of researching.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it did, yeah. And we have Travis. Sorry. Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? You have Travis McMahon as Darko. He was in a film called Cactus, and in a few other dramas there. Angus Sampson as Dan, he was in Mad Max Fury Road. Tom Budge as Jono, and Luke Ford as Burke, who also is in Paris War, and Deadline Gallipoli. So they're not huge stars outside of Australia, but within Australia, I think they're very well-known TV personalities. I think some of the actors went on to be in the Australian version of Dancing with the Stars, but it's not. It's not a movie that. It's as we said with Long, the Short, and the Tall. Even though these men aren't possibly well-known outside of Australia, I think it helps these sorts of movies because when you're watching the Attack Force C, you're well aware that's Mel Gibson and Sam Neill, who go on to have huge careers, and it can pull you out of certain scenes. But this movie really is, I think, much more effectual because they're sort of everymen. It doesn't pull you out. You're not thinking, oh, there's a, pick a star like Channing Tatum or whoever doing a dodgy Australian accent. These are actual Australians telling Australian stories that made by an Australian team. It's I think that's one of the really good things about these movies. All the movies we've covered is that,
and they're all very competent as well.
And they're all very competent.
I think that's the point that I was going to make as well. I think for outsiders not knowing who these individuals are, it's a very powerful film because they act so brilliantly well. I can't think of any of them that I wouldn't have put into those roles. They all did it. They play their roles really, really well. There's no overacting. There's none of the stuff that we saw in the 50s and 60s where people were, they would act to a part. They were just being themselves. There's a hard, difficult environment, and they just got into it. It was it's really impressive, actually.
There's a realism to it,
yes,
which I think. Well, I got a review here this week from the Sydney Morning Herald from April 2006 when the film was released. And I'll just read you an excerpt from the end of the review. So it says, Grierson directs the early fighting with a good sense of panic and confusion. Some men adapt quickly and are good at it. Others bolt and are soon dead. The realism of these jungle skirmishes is one of the best things about the movie. Grierson gives them great immediacy and doesn't really matter who's who, just what they do. The movie is less successful in the quieter scenes. When characterization does matter, none of them is fully realized character, and that reduces the film's dramatic power. They're more like sketches, each of whom will be given a scene in which to show his mettle. That's the film's shortcoming. It's all of the lonic decency of the Australian soldiers who fought on the Kokoda Trail is easy to understand, but it's not drama enough. When the impulse becomes to pay tribute, drama sometimes disappears.
Do you know what? I think that's actually fair, isn't it? Because they are a whole series of vignettes that do depend on the characterization of each of the roles, and some are stronger than others. There's no doubt about that. But I think that's being really pernickety about it. I think if you step back and you see the whole story as one, how do you take 6 or 7 men in a section without an officer? You've got to emphasize the characterization, then you've got to try and keep it together. So you've got to have some individual scenes, and then you've got to keep it rolling together. I think actually they do a pretty good job, actually, and I think there are some of the roles were played stronger than others, but I think on the whole they did a jolly good job in bringing it together. You get a real sense of, the one thing that review doesn't mention is the psychological dimension. I think that's a really powerful part of the film, and it struck me right from the beginning that you're really sitting in the head of these guys, struggling with their own demons and struggling with, they don't know each other really. They're not mates yet. There are people, people are trying to assert their authority when the platoon commander's killed. How do you stop people running away and, getting banded by the Japanese? How do you keep everyone together? And that's the terror, the psychological discipline, all that sort of stuff is actually played really well. I was very impressed with that.
I think that's interesting because you can see it that way, and then you could also say that it strikes a balance quite well because you can go too far with characterization. And when you think about a film like this, it's a section of lads that have been thrust together. Some of them know each other quite well, others don't. But I think there's enough on the bones of the characterizations and the way it's written that when one of them dies, you feel for them. When there's an argument, you side with someone. So you've mentally formed an attachment, and you've formed opinions on these characters and what their choices are and what they do. For instance, when the Brain Gunners number 2 says we need to go and look for him. I forget the chap's name. Is it Bluey? I think it might be Bluey.
Bluey or John
that stays behind.
Yeah,
one of the Brain Gunners. Anyway, and he says he didn't give a shit about you. He wasn't your friend. He wasn't your mate. And the guy's crestfallen. And those are moments that build the characters for the viewer, I think. And it could have gone the complete opposite direction and given us lots of exposition about their lives and their backgrounds and what they'd done before the war and where they come from. But I think that would have been unnecessary in this because, one, they're in the jungle, they're cut off behind essentially enemy lines. So they wouldn't have been talking and having big conversations about what they're going to do when they get back home and, whether they've got a girlfriend or not, and all those classic war film tropes.
Yeah, there's no time for the tropes, is there? That's what I like about it.
This is set over, I think it's 26th to the 30th of August was the Battle of Israel. And this patrol it was based on was trying to get back to the main line, and they're behind enemy lines for the majority of that time, so they aren't going to be talking about insignificant things. It's going to be very much to the point in the moment, so there isn't room for that characterization to grow. And I think there's enough within their interactions that it connects you to them and you feel involved and invested.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that is actually the power of the film. That we aren't given the backstories that then sort of influences either way to these characters' personalities. That they, what we see is what we get. It's in the moment. It's the terror. Yes, it's the Japanese attack. It's the jungle. It's trying to deal with each other. It's trying to deal with lots and lots of unusual circumstances that's being thrown at these young men, and they have to decide there and now what to do about it. And I think the extraordinary thing about this story is how all these individuals do come together as a team, and by the end of it, they are welded together by blood and experience, and it's a very powerful way of telling the story. And I think the filmmakers achieved what they set out to do. This is pretty clear. And you can either, when you're doing a film, you can either say it at the start, this is what the story's about, or you can just let it happen. And you can see right in the final scene where the chap from the 2nd 16th Battalion says, we need some help. And the Chocos, almost without being told, actually, pick up their weapons and wander off to go and help the men of the AIF fight the Japanese. They were a team. And that experience had welded them together, and you could see it. That was a product of the film, and it was achieved pretty well.
Interestingly, they wanted to make a much bigger film. They wanted to do more of an overarching film about the actual campaign, but budget restraints saw them go for just that one section.
Yeah, I read that too.
Perhaps it's for the better. I think maybe it gives it a more personal touch than a broader top-down view of a battle like that.
I think maybe some of it may have been lost if they'd gone broad.
I think one of the really interesting thing is, yes, when the survivors of the 39th Battalion got back to the lines, you could tell they did this really well. You could tell who were the Chocos, and you could tell who were the regular soldiers. The regular soldiers were strutting around with classic discipline and wearing their hats and all this sort of stuff. So I think that they did tell that story very well. And when they were in the trench together, there was no difference between the Chocos and the regular soldiers. So yeah, it would have been great to have a full story of the campaign, but they didn't. They achieved a really good combination with the shorter film.
I agree. And before we move on, we always ask our listeners what they think, and we got some good one-word reviews this week. A.D. Bond says mateship. Jonas Grumby goes with humate. Our own historical firearms Matthew Moss says big brain energy. That's a favourite of the show. Trevor Eswoods goes with Bonza. And finally, we have Michael Nelson, who says muddy, which you can't argue with that. The film was very muddy.
Not.
But I think the consensus across the board, I think when we mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, I know we had our friend Woody of World War II TV. He was talking about the speech given at the end. And I know that the general consensus is this is a real gem of a movie. And I think it's, as we've mentioned in the last 20 minutes, it is a really interesting film. So maybe we should go into the alley tally, talk a little bit more about the kit, and the historical things on the show.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
Rob, you're our guest this week. You're in the hot seat.
I think they did it really well. I think seeing the 1942 equipment, it was just spot on, actually. Seeing the SMLEs and the Tommy guns, which is particularly powerful because, of course, as we know, this was before the Owen gun arrived. And the one thing we didn't see was the Lewis gun, because battalions at that time were equipped with Lewis guns. This is before the Bren arrived. But this is a particular bugbear of mine, because I think this was portrayed really well in the film, which is the importance of automatic weapons in the jungle. And the Bren guns and the Tommy guns really did make an enormous impact. The Japanese had 3 automatic weapons in every section. They were heavily automated. And yet, if you compare what the Australians experienced in New Guinea with what the Indian Army experienced in Burma, many Indian soldiers had never, ever heard, let alone seen, else the other way around, seen, let alone heard an automatic weapon until the Japanese turned up. So they got that very, very right. I mean, apparently we've heard today that the Bren guns turned up later in time for the real defense of the ridge, but seeing them portrayed like that in the film was really good. I like the emphasis on the Japanese use of bayonets. Japanese were very much a sword-based army. They believed that fighting with swords was the epitome of the samurai experience, and you could only really fight properly if you did it with a sword. So officers never ever had rifles or weapons of any kind. They always just fought with their swords, which is why so many of them lost their lives. And soldiers also would fight with the bayonet. And there's a famous scene where Corporal Wolstead is killed with the bayonet. And that particular scene itself, actually, I like the psychological terror to it. He's hiding from the Japanese soldier. He rolls out, eventually thinking the Japanese soldier's gone, and the man is standing above him. I've read quite a lot around the Malayan campaign where there's lots of those sorts of experiences where, from the Japanese perspective, Japanese records describe killing Australian soldiers in exactly that way. They would, they were almost like lambs to the slaughter, because they didn't know how to react. They were frankly caught in terror. In fact, I was reading some of them today. So I thought, the Ali Tali, brilliant for me. I think the historical advisors to the film got it absolutely right. I mean, you know what it's like sitting watching films and they've got the wrong weapons. And actually, the one thing I really enjoyed was that young soldier, whose name I forget, trying to teach himself how to strip a Tommy gun and get it back together again. Yeah, and and getting it wrong and taking a lot of time and always making a mess of it. Well, that takes me back to my soldiering days, and that's absolutely right. You've got to get those drills slick, and it just reminds you of how green the Chocos were.
Yeah, it comes into play at the end where he's in the firing line there, and he does have a jam, and he instinctively knows how to sort the jam out. And he, if he hadn't have had that jam, then the guys would have come up on the flank. He gives them a burst. So everything has a reason. That's another thing about the movie I like, that everyone has a circle of sort of their character, even if it's a very small arc. His arc is he's finally learned how to clean his Thompson. It's a really small thing, but it's a really nice inclusion. I like, everything you said there, Rob, fantastic. I really like just the weathering of the men's equipment as they go along. If this was a 50s war movie, they'd come out of the jungle spick and span like they do in
a little bit like Green Beret.
Yeah, like Green Berets or something like that. Yeah, no one comes out pristine. I like that. Even rips on buttons, things like that. It's just really nice to see, because as you see in pictures of the chaps from the time, they are grimy, they are dirty. It's not a nice place to fight the jungle. And then just the small detail of men smoking cigarettes made out of book pages and things. It's just the tiny little details that make the movie. And it is one, I must admit, I for the first time in a while, I didn't actually sit up in my chair and go, well, what's wrong with that kit there? I didn't have to. because I didn't think there was anything really out of place. One thing I did see is really panicky, but a guy's got a Thompson swing on a Lee Enfield, but that's like the only very, very small thing there. But that's incredibly small.
Well, it may well have been the case. He probably wanted a sling, and the only sling that was available was that.
Of course,
you do chop and change things.
That's very true, Matt.
You make do and mend.
True. Anything you like, Matt?
We've touched on a lot of it already, but the Japanese kit's really great. I mean, the way that the film characterizes the Japanese is really interesting because it shows them as fleeting, almost ghost-like, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in a moment when we talk about favorite scenes. And Rob's already mentioned it, but when we do see them, they're striking figures, and they've all got Type 98 Arasakas. And then there's that great sequence of the ambush where there's a Type 92 medium machine gun or heavy machine gun set up, and that gets completely demolished by a burst from a Bren and a Thompson. But as we've already said, that the big Bren energy of this film is off the charts because not only do we get a really good representation of a Bren team, we get a number 1 and a number 2.
It's like unheard of in movie land. Really.
Yeah, that is extremely good.
It is,
by the way. Yeah, it's extremely good. Enjoyed that.
We get to see magazines being changed by the number 2. We also get to see people filling magazines from charges as well. So there's a bit where they're in the shack and he's seen stripping rounds out of a 5-round charger and he's putting them into a Bren magazine. Just those little, I suppose, small bits of doctrine and training that you don't normally see in a lot of war films is a really nice inclusion. And as you said, the Thompson and the cleaning was really interesting because at the beginning of the film he struggles to line up the butts and get the butt to fit back into the receiver, and then later on he's being timed by one of his oppos, and then at the end of the film it all comes into a full circle, and it's that growth of character again. So throughout that film we've seen him go from raw to being able to put a Thompson back together after cleaning it in 10 seconds and being there at the moment when it's necessary to oppose that flanking attack. And then you're sad that he gets killed in the end anyway. He's shot in that moment of, where he's saved the flank, more or less.
Even the bit in that scene where I forget the character's name, oh my gosh, when Sam's shouting for him to stick another mag in the top, he's not looking over his shoulder like going, oh, where is he? He's
keeping his eye front,
keeping his gun on the enemy, which is another really great little detail. It's the armourer, props to the armourer and the historical advisor on this one. They must have really beamed in on the accuracy there.
But there's a little bit more to it than that, actually, and that is doctrine. So military doctrine is really important here, and I think this is one of the points that the film really does get fabulously right. One of the things people forget in the early years of the war was and some units, and it's clear that the Australians had kept the importance of machine gun doctrine from the First World War. So in 1918, infantry platoons in 1917, the infantry manual changed the structure of platoons, and it was changed again in 1918, so that infantry platoons ended up with 4 sections. One section was the machine gun section with 2 Lewis guns. And effectively, think about platoons just being organizations that coalesced around the machine gun, and everyone was there to protect the machine gun, get the ammunition into the magazines for the Lewis gun, and change the Lewis. All the soldiers would have Hessian sacks full of, sometimes canvas bags full of Lewis gun magazines, and they would just keep the gun firing. That was the most important thing. And the Lewis gun could fire 400 rounds without, the barrel getting too hot. It's exactly that doctrine which was translated to the Bren gun. They didn't change the doctrine at all. The most important weapon in the platoon, the section and the platoon, was the Bren gun, and all the soldiers applied the same approach, and it's really powerful to see. And as a historian, having studied infantry doctrine in 1917 some time ago, but I do remember it, this is really interesting actually, because it's interesting to see the Australians had retained a very clear understanding of the importance of the machine gun in the sections and platoons, but the British Army hadn't, and the Indian Army hadn't as well. And it took the British and the Indian Army really until, probably early 1944 to get that back.
I think it's interesting as well. I think I was reading that they didn't have Vickers guns in the Kokoda Trail because they thought
No mortars, no.
You think
no
it's
heavy machine guns.
You're using the locals to help ferry men. I'm sure they would have been more than happy to help ferry heavier weapons up that track.
I don't think they would have been happy to carry them.
Well, maybe not, but I'm sure they would have done it if it would have needed it. I just thought it was an interesting little thing there, because I know there's a line in Perra's War where he's saying, well, this didn't happen. They didn't have like Vickers guns. I think is a really throwaway line, which I thought was quite interesting anyway. But sorry, Matt, please continue.
One other thing about the Brens I thought was really interesting. There's a scene early on where a lad scoops up some water in his helmet and throws it onto the barrel. And his number one says, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Because I think he obscures his line of sight for a moment. But the number two is thinking about keeping the gun cool.
And it's really, really good point, because you never saw a barrel change. Now, that's something that clearly would have happened on a regular basis. But you can't stick everything into a film.
No.
And then you've got to ask yourself, without that mitt, how do you change the barrel on a Bren gun? It's very difficult.
Very true.
Anyway, there's too much detail. But actually, I think for someone who really understands machine gun doctrine, the film got it right. Really impressive.
Yeah, it's a Bren fan's dream. This one, it really is. Even down to the sounds, like
and firing from the hip. And we haven't seen that in a film since Hill and Korea on the pod. Yeah, so that's
the sound as well. Of the Bren's firing, very distinctive, and they haven't just got a stock machine gun sound like you sometimes get. It's the actual Bren, the really distinct thud, and the mechanism and everything.
There's a metallic ring to the end of a Bren.
That's nice. It's the cacophony of war in this movie. Everything is so well.
The sound design on the film is stunning. I think really, they've managed to capture not only the sounds of the jungle, but rain, the squelch of mud, small arms fire, animals. I think they capture it really beautifully. I think that
just elevates everything.
It does. I was going to say that myself. I think it really lifts the film, because it could have been flat. I think it could have looked fantastic, but if it had sounded flat, then we would have noticed. I think
one of the points about the sound is that you really get a sense of so when you're firing in the jungle, the sound is captured in the immediate environment. It's almost as though it's swirling around you. It's not dissipated because the jungle is keeping it in. You get a real sense of that in the film. So you're overwhelmed by the rain and the fear, but also the noise. I mean, it really is pulsating, banging, noisy. Battle is a noisy place, and it's caught really well.
But then on the flip side, the quiet is a killer as well, because once it goes silent, you're thinking, oh God, the Japanese could be anywhere, and that obviously might play into the myth, but of the Japanese sort of being these supermen. But it kind of feels right in the way the movie portrays it. I feel it's you think, gosh, are they ever safe? And they never feel like they're safe until they're back in what's meant to be Minari village at the end. They never feel safe until they're there with all their mates. It's quite a powerful thing. But maybe we should move into fave scenes.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
Well, I like, there are lots of scenes that I could describe. The one I think I've chosen is where Corporal Wilstead, who's played by Ewan Leslie, is killed by a Japanese soldier, and he's run away from the rest of the section in terror as the Japanese attack. And this is something you never do, because you're better off with your mates together, where your firepower can play a bigger role than yourself. He's actually terrified witless, so he's running away, and he falls down an incline and crawls under it, sees a dead Japanese soldier, and is horrified and crawls under a log and just wants to get away from it all. And of course he can't, and eventually he comes out from under the log and he's staring at a Japanese soldier. Now, before I get to that particular scene, the Japanese are depicted, I think, they are dressed fabulously well, probably overly done. It's as though all of those Japanese soldiers are on the combat parade ground. They've got everything right, everything's perfect. There's no, they are like jungle supermen, and we know that they weren't. The Japanese were a notoriously untidy soldier, And but it does play to the perceptions of the Australians here that they were fighting a top-notch, and they were fighting top-notch fighting men. And as I said earlier, he's lying there in terror. He's watching this Japanese guy with a bayonet right near his eye, and then the next bit, you don't get a reprieve. He's not let off or taken prisoner. The Japanese soldier bayonets him through the eye and kills him. And that is, as I said earlier, a common experience. I mean, the Japanese liked using the bayonet. They thought that this was a particularly virtuous way of fighting. And in the early years of the war, actually, there was lots, particularly from the Malayan campaign, there's lots of evidence of just bayonet fighting, particularly in the dark. And of course, this reinforces all the fears of the soldiers there. They're fighting someone who's ferociously competent and nasty and all this sort of stuff. All those terrors are coalesced together. Yeah. But that's my favorite scene, I think, because you get a sense of the terror, the fact that actually these were ordinary men running away from battle. You need real discipline to stay in battle when someone's firing at you, and to return fire and do something sensible. And I think that it's captured it very, very well.
The way that scene's actually shot is quite masterful. It's a combination of close-ups, and then it pulls out to show a wider angle of the corporal on the ground, and then the Japanese soldier stood over him with the bayonet at the ready. And the way that shot is really effective, because you get a sort of a point of view shot from the corporal. You see the bayonet in his face, and then you realize that it's lined up with his actual eye. It's not aimed at his body, it's aimed at his head. And he goes into like a low thrust. It's just such a shocking moment. And then you get that earth-shattering scream from the corporal, which just ebbs away quite quickly. And it's a really stunning sequence. And there's a few of those in the film that are really quite effective like that, I think, in the same sort of way.
We've almost borrowed from the horror movie genre where they're doing some of these things. It's all very eerie and very sort of scary and gritty. You sort of feel that you could have the same sort of shot in a slasher film of someone getting impaled on a whatever. It feels the same way. I think it leans into some different aspects of movie making just to reiterate the goriness and the bloodiness of war. I quite enjoyed the sort of, it didn't feel like a generic Second World War movie in certain sequences, which really is one of the film's strengths. Matt, what about your favorite scene?
The one that stands out to me is the sequence where Max is wounded with an abdomen wound. He's been left in the shack by the rest of the section with, I can't remember, is it Burke who stays behind with him, the young lad?
This is the film's thing,
I can't remember,
because they don't set anyone up very well, so it's hard to remember sometimes.
Well, you know them by looking at them, but it's by name. I couldn't tell you. But anyway,
exactly, as well. Yeah.
Exactly, you can't tell some of them apart. But it doesn't really matter anyway. But he's stayed behind, and inevitably the Japanese come by this village, and they've been there before because they've already killed the locals. They're found amongst their own crops, and that's quite a striking scene on its own. Which I thought was really powerful, that they buried them. They exhausted as they were, they took the time to scrape out a grave for these locals that had been killed, and then they move on eventually to try and get back to the lines, because I think that the Bren gunner is very adamant that he wants to get back into the fight. But anyway, the Japanese arrive at the little hamlet again, and the soldier that stayed behind with Max, the wounded man, decides that the best way to protect Max is to lure the Japanese away. So he fires a round at them from his rifle and then dashes into the jungle. And this sequence is really great because it illustrates quite nicely how the film creates tension in a really organic way. So we've got the tension of Max knowing that the Japanese are going to come in at any second and he can't reach his rifle. And then at the same time, in the jungle, the young soldier that's run off into the jungle is thank you. He's waiting for the Japanese to come round the bend, essentially, and he's ready with his rifle over a tree trunk. And there's a number of shots of over his shoulder, looking down the track, waiting, and they're not there, and he doesn't understand why they aren't appearing. and then we get an almost smash cut of he turns, and then there's 3 Japanese soldiers right behind him. And it's one of those shots that reinforces that wraith-like, ghost-like portrayal of the Japanese in this film. They're festooned with bits of brush and greenery, so they've got that great field craft going, and they're ruthless. As soon as he turns around, they all pounce on him, firing and stabbing, and that's it. That's the end of the scene for him, anyway. And the tension of that moment, and then the tension of Max trying to reach his rifle, only for one of the locals, I think he looks like a village elder, perhaps, turns and comes through the door. After I think he may have seen off the Japanese out of shot. It's just a very powerful little scene that shows how well the film creates that tension, and also it's a great little piece of narrative showing the end of one character and the saving of another. I think that's a really powerful little scene.
And it shows the relationship between the locals and the Australians as well in a little way. Now that he's been found and he's going to make it back, or there's a very high chance he's going to make it back now, which I also think that is a nice thing to lean into that the movie does.
Well, one of the very interesting things that it does is it demonstrates also one of the reasons why what were known as, the local New Guineans, known as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, supported the diggers. And this is because the Japanese treated them so badly. And it's exactly the same story in the hills of Nagaland and Assam and through Burma. Whereas the Japanese never really understood that what they need to be doing is getting the locals on side. And, if they'd left the locals alone or, paid for their food or what, then they would have had less inclination to support the Australians, but the opposite was the case. And right through the film, you get a really clear sense about the amazing support given to the 39th Battalion and the regulars of the AIF by the local New Guinea men. Really quite a powerful. And also, and it needs to be said, a very good depiction, and not that it's good, but a clear depiction of the brutality of the Japanese army, because you can't have a film about the Imperial Japanese Army without the rapine and their brutality being expressed in some way, and I think they did it particularly well.
They're learning the Japanese's tactics firsthand.
Yes.
They haven't had the time to reassess how they're going to fight them. All the things those men must have been hearing going into Moresby was, the Japanese are awful. They do this, they do that. Leaning into that anti-Japanese propaganda that the West propped up throughout the whole entire war. So I kind of understand they went for that, even if unconsciously did it, but whether they went for that depiction of the Japanese, just maybe to make it feel a bit more authentic for the men that were being portrayed, perhaps. But for me, it's got to be the end sequence where they've all made it. Well, the 2 main characters, Sam and Jack, have made it back. As well as Jack's brother. They're in the line to see the doctor, and he's like, "Come on, lads, what's it going to be? Is it bums, tums, and whatever?" He's giving it the whole sort of kindly doctor speech, and a runner comes in, and the runner is all dishevelled and looks like he's been through it, and the boys all around that look exhausted, wounded, look like they're on death's door. Some of them just instinctively know that they're going to be called. They're either going to be called on the line or asked to volunteer, and they all get up and they start walking away. And the doctor, there's music building. The doctor just says, "Boys, like, what are you doing?" Like, "No, don't. What the hell are you doing?" But then the rains come down, and for me, it's like the washing away of the sins. It's washing. It's very poetic little bit of filmmaking there. That the rain exonerating the men before they go and fight the big battle at the end. Powerful piece of filmmaking that I wasn't expecting.
I like that particularly because what it did is it showed that the disaggregated individuality of the early scenes has now been has now coalesced into this sense that the only way they're going to get through this is by working as a team, and there are no individuals. This is the team. This is the whole platoon or company going out to fight the Japanese. It's quite powerful, working together. If you work individually, you'll get separated by the Japanese and killed. If you work together, it's a different story.
Another scene that plays into that is a little bit earlier on where Jack has been wounded in the leg, and they wake up in the morning to find he's gone. And they move off, and it shows him sat in a tree trunk just within the camp, because he's slowing them down, and he's made the decision not to carry on.
Well, he's made the decision to go on at his own speed and not to hold them back, and I think that's really quite powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
there's all little sort of little self-sacrificing moments, bits of courage all the way through. And I think the one thing another thing I think that the movie did excellently was, for me at least, I think it's one of the best uses of primary source material in a movie used. So the character is called the Lieutenant. You don't get a name, but I think he's meant to be based on Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Horner of the 39th Militia Battalion, and he gave a speech, quite a famous speech in Minari Village. I won't read it all. I'll read a little bit from the end. It's a man's nobility made transcendent in the fiery crucible of war, faithfulness and fortitude, gentleness and compassion. I'm honoured to be your brother. And it's played over men who are lined up. They look as battered and bruised as they did when they went into the line. Some men they've all got their sticks. It's a shot for shot almost of a scene in Kokoda front line. There's lots of pictures on the AWM of this speech, but it's such a great use of that speech, because it's true, it happened. Reviewers, I think, unfairly said it was soapy and it felt too twee and sweet, but this actually happened. Yeah. He did say this to his men. People think officer class sometimes very stiff. We get that horrible stiff upper lip thing that we think of British officers, that they get unfairly represented. But this man's just showing admiration for what his troops have just been through. And you feel it as a viewer. At the end of this movie, you've gone through the same experiences of all of these men. And then to get the kind words from the CEO, even though it might not make the experience of war go away, but it at least they get thanked, because sometimes these movies don't go into that. And it's just a great way to end the movie.
I love that, actually, and you're right. It's very authentic, and I think it was done very well. And I think the really important thing about this in battle is having someone, and the commanding officer or the company commander or the battalion commander is great where it happens, who can articulate this sense of comradeship and sacrifice they've all been through, and the oneness that they now experience, because that's what battle does, is really, really powerful. And I can tell you now, this wouldn't have sounded cliched to the men. They would have recognized, looking at the boss who had been through it all themselves, who was as dirty and as disheveled and as exhausted as the rest of them, that they had come through the crucible of fire, as he described it, crucible of battle, and they had triumphed. And this was a very, very important moment in the team, and indeed in the Australian sense of itself and its ability, the Australian ability to fight the Japanese and defend Australia. This is a really seminal moment in the film. This isn't just a battalion of diggers in the New Guinean hills. This is the defense of Australia. This is something really quite extraordinary they've achieved, and he's put it into words. It's really important for soldiers to have that put into words in a way that they understand, and they all knew. They knew in their hearts that they had achieved something significant.
Yeah, there's a great documentary called for the 50th anniversary. It's on the AWM, sorry. It's Kokoda Track of Hell or something. But all the veterans that were there for that speech, they say how great it was to hear that, and gave them solace. And
yeah, exactly right. It's a very powerful. I've seen the same documentary. It's very powerful.
Great, isn't it? It's fantastic. Maybe we should go final thoughts.
Hello, I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to Fighting on Film, the world's #1 war film podcast.
Well, final thought for me, a really powerful film. And I hadn't seen this before. And I'm a little bit skeptical about Australian war movies. I remember Gallipoli, and I just felt that there was too much Brit bashing going on. And I just thought, this is perpetuating some myths that are really unfair, and we know where they were made. But actually, this one surprised me. This was a really good, gritty, psychological thriller. It was accurate so far as I can determine. It was really well made. I mean, it's worth watching again, and it's not an easy film to watch, and you need to sit down and be prepared for it. But I think it's a bit of a triumph, actually.
Yeah, I'd sentiment that. Matt, what about you?
I think it's a beautifully shot film. I think in terms of filmmaking, it's perhaps one of the best we've seen, and we've seen some really good ones during this ANZAC month. We've looked at some really great films, but the way it's shot, the canted angles, the close-ups, those beautiful panning shots, the atmospheric sound design on the film, all add up to create a really atmospheric, authentic feeling film that tells a story that no other filmmaker's really gone into, which I think is an interesting thing to note, that other than the original documentary made during the war, there aren't really many that have touched on Kokoda. I thought it was really great to see the Papua New Guinea war carriers, the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, depicted in such a realistic, generous, proper way. I thought that was really admirable. I love the way that the film created tension, and I really liked the organic way that the relationships between the men grew over the few days that were with them in that, the patrol as it reaches back to the lines. And the big brain energy, who can't like that? I mean, it's the cherry on the top of the cake, isn't it? It's a really solid film. I would highly recommend anyone watch it.
Echo both of your sentiments there. I mean, I think it's one of the best films we've covered, because it even though it's made in 2006, 15 years ago, whatever it is now, it still feels modern, feels like it could have come out yesterday. Nothing dates this movie. It's a part of the war that sometimes can get a little bit forgotten about. I know we keep saying it's the forgotten army, the forgotten war in the Far East, but unfortunately I think it sometimes can feel that way. And it's just a very, as you've both said, technically great, the story's great, the characters are interesting. As it's a gritty film. It's not a sort of all white smiles and isn't war great and isn't fighting and being a soldier fantastic at the end and we just beat the enemy, we're going to go home and all have a piece of cherry pie. It's not like that. War isn't like that anyway. But as I said, it's just a fantastic film, and it should be up there and it should be heralded with the greats from the genre. And it's another great way of, when a film doesn't quite have the budget to do what you want, you can still do something that is as good. Learn what Kokoda's done within the war movie genre. Let's have more of that. Let's have less sort of B movie rubbish, because you can still do it.
I think one of the reasons why the film was so good is that all of the individual characters were played beautifully, and they coalesce with, as Matt says, with all the technical sophistication of the cinematographer's art. I mean, and that's quite unusual. Often there are gaps, aren't there? And but there weren't. It's as though all the actors really knew what they were trying to get out of this, and they played it beautifully. It's the seamless nature of the story and the way it's portrayed is really powerful.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we more than implore you to go and find a copy. It's out there in internet land. It's available on DVD, and you can rent it, I think, from YouTube as well if you want to. So thanks again, Robert, for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking war movies with you. Thanks very much.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you to everyone for joining us for ANZAC Month as well.
Yeah, it's been fantastic.
I think it's been really great. I've really enjoyed watching all these various different Australian films, and we need to find some New Zealand war films for next ANZAC Month, I think.
Taika Waititi did one about the Maori soldiers, the little shorts. Maybe we could chase him.
Yes, I remember you saying, that'd be great to cover.
Yeah, as Matt said, thanks for joining us for ANZAC Month. I know it bled into May, but who doesn't mind an extra ANZAC film, especially when it's this good? Follow us on the socials, Facebook, Twitter, and at fightingonfilm.com, and we will catch you again next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, guys.